Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Royal Blue Podcast, a 90s special. I'm Phil Kirkbride, and today joined by Dave Prentice and Gav Buckland for part 2 of the look back at the decade. Part 1, the birth of a new decade, and took us right up to, in a very turbulent manner, where Joe Royle was to be appointed, and that is where we begin part 2 today. We talk about Royle's impact, and then we go on to talk about Howard Kendall's return, the day against Coventry, and of course, other things in between, and positively, of course, a couple of trips to Wembley where we returned with some silverware. Chaps, we'll kick off without further ado because there is plenty to get through as the first part showed. I'll throw it open. Joe Royle came into the football club as manager in November 1994. Can you summarise the impact that Joe had in his tenure?
Wow, what a question. First of all, I would advise the listeners to crack open a can of beer or put the kettle on because there's a lot to get through in this one. And it is a very, very turbulent time in true Everton tradition. Joe's impact was immense in a very, very short period of time. He will always tell you that, for him, the most important aspect of his entire Everton life was keeping Everton in the Premier League in 1994-95. He quite rightly gets credit for winning the FA Cup and being the last Everton manager, to bring silverware to the football club. But you cannot underestimate the part he played in keeping Everton in the Premier League. Mike Walker was a disaster. I know we actually, sort of mentioned about that in the previous podcast. But Joe inherited a team that had got 7 points from, was it 11 games or even 13 games? It was an appalling start to a season, the worst start to a season in the club's entire history. And from that point, he then suddenly had to get top 6 football in terms of points gathering to keep Everton in the Premier League. And he did. His impact was immediate. He watched a mini derby at Anfield where Everton reserves beat Liverpool reserves 4-0. It was during an international break. And he couldn't quite understand why Joe Parkinson, John Ebrell and Andy Hinchcliffe were all playing for Everton reserves. So he immediately drafted them into the senior squad, played them in his first game, which was a Merseyside derby on a Monday night against the Liverpool team, who were third in the table. And it was almost like boys' own stuff. I mean, you had Duncan Ferguson, who was the eternal anti-hero, who'd been breathalyzed 48 hours previously by the police for driving the wrong way into Skellon Street bus station. Sorry, the car park on Paradise Street. And he was over the limit. So you got the centre forward who was, been drinking only 2 or 3 days before the game. Went to war that night. Neil Ruddock made the fatal mistake of kicking him in the first half, and that was it. So the red mist came down, and Duncan was a man inspired. Won that game 2-0. It was an incredible evening. And to be honest, I genuinely think that night was the night where Duncan, something shifted in his mentality. I think he realised this was where he belonged. So I'd spoken to him earlier in that season, and I don't think he realised I was a pressman at the time, which is why he deigned to talk to me, and asked him about the prospect of staying at Everton beyond his loan spell. And he just said, nah, I wouldn't have thought so. So I genuinely thought he believed it was a loan, and that was it. And it was that night when he realised how loved he was, he realised the impact he could have on the support base, that something shifted, and he thought, wow, something's moving here. Anyway, Everton won 2-0, then beat Leeds 3-0 in the next match, beat Chelsea away 1-0, Paul Rideout scored, and it was like a team that couldn't buy a result or buy a clean sheet. Was beating some of the better teams in the Premier League. And it was weird. You got the new manager bounce, obviously, from Joe coming in, but he also changed things significantly. So like I say, he brought those 3 individuals into the first team fold. He toughened things up. He's unashamedly, sort of introduced his dogs of war, as he branded them himself. And if you look a little bit later on that season, and I noticed there were 2 games where we finished up with 9 men. We got 2 men sent off at Newcastle, 2 men sent off at Leicester City, and still got a point at Leicester. So Everton unashamedly set about teams. Joe used to have this great catchphrase he'd give to Barry Horn, where he'd say, Barry, discourage them for me, please. Barry would go out there and he would discourage midfielders. I remember Rick George, who worked for the Echo back then with the Liverpool writer, coming into the office one day and telling me, he goes, Jamie Redknapp's been kicking off about Barry Horn. I hate that Barry Horn. He says, he always tries to do you. And when I told Barry that, Barry loved it because he knew psychologically, so he was winning the battle. So lots and lots of, sort of elements, sort of were complicit in Everton suddenly turning the season around the way they did. But undoubtedly the one factor entirely was Joe Royle. Totally transformed that football club in the space of a fortnight.
Gav, can you remember, and forgive me if we touched on this briefly in the first part, Mike Walker is sacked. Was Joe the only candidate? Was he the only man that the club were thinking of at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. Unlike, say, 1990, and even when Mike Walker had got the job in 94, there was not a great deal of competition for Joe. I think Ron Atkinson was mentioned, and he just had the vote of confidence from Aston Villa at the time. So Joe was the only person I think in the frame. Maybe he should have got the job at 90. I'm with Preno on this. I mean, it was quite savvy, weren't it? He sacked Walker, and then there was a 2-week international break where I think him and Willie Donachie had the chance to look at. I think Joe said he got a load of tapes, didn't he? And they said that they looked at the team and just too soft, too easy to play against. And he brought in, as you say, Parkinson. I think Limpar was playing for the reserves as well, wasn't he, Preno?
Yeah.
And he brought them in. So it was pretty back to basic stuff. And all of a sudden, in the space of 3 or 4 weeks, that the whole mood had changed around the club. And not only that, we were hard to beat, but we weren't conceding any goals. I think we probably 7 or 8 goals without conceding. So that's what Howard.
Actually, a club record. We actually went 7 games without conceding a goal, which was a club record at the time.
Which is what managers do. Good managers do, don't they? The first thing they do is shore up the defence, and that's what Howard used to do. So Joe was the only person for the job, and he got. Thankfully for us, he got immediate results. I mean, the other one about Preno, just to add on, there's a story about. I think he knew how to wind up people up, especially Liverpool. If you remember the talk about Jamie Redknapp, remember the Anfield derby, Preno, in January 1995. It was goalless draw, wasn't it? And I think Roy Evans came out afterwards to complain about Everton's robust tactics, shall we say. Yeah. And I think Joe said, I can hear the sound of dummies being thrown out of prams here, So he knew how to handle that sort of, Liverpool-Everton rivalry because he's obviously been a player here. Having been a player for so long and being ingrained in the club, it's an enormous difference. Made enormous difference to coming in and making an instant impact.
He had a great manner about him and still does, so he's a very engaging individual. And if you think about, I mentioned in the earlier podcast that, Mike Walker did not have the respect of, all of the players at the football club. Joe immediately did have the respect just because of the way he dealt with them and the way, so he handled them. He didn't embrace all of them. I mean, Vinnie Samways famously was a player he just didn't rate at all. And, bombed him out of the squad immediately. And when he left the club the following year, he gave this interview where he said, yes, very, very pointed. He said, I'd like to thank Vinny for the one match that we won during his tenure at Everton Football Club. And he had this real, sort of tongue-in-cheek way of bringing people, sort of down to earth. But I know the players of that, that group got on brilliantly with him. So the players that he embraced as his lieutenants, if you like, so Barry Horn, Joe Parkinson, Andy Hinchcliffe, Paul Ridehouse, all really, really respected him. And there was clearly a great dynamic that was untapped in that squad of players at the time. Mike Walker hadn't been able to tap into it, but Joe did. And I think he said very early in that season, he actually recommended to Peter Johnson to put money on Everton to win the FA Cup. He says, because we're going to be playing cup-tie football this season. We need to play cup-tie football to survive. So, it might not be a bad idea putting money on us to win the cup. And he did. And he got players like Barry Horn, Joe Parkinson, John Ebrell, absolutely, running through hoops for him. I think he made that quip himself, didn't he, about the derby match? He says, a crisp packet blew onto the pitch, and Barry and Joe tried to tackle it. And it was that kind of mentality that was at work, and they embraced it. The players embraced it. Joe embraced it. So Willie on the training pitch, they all got on really well with Willie Donachie. It was a really tough taskmaster, but so a really good down to earth guy as well. And the mood was transformed, and it needed to, because the club was in absolutely dire straits, and it needed that degree of turnaround just to stay in the Premier League.
Gav, you mentioned it about the derby. What's it say about Joe as a manager that he was able to come in the first game, a derby? Now, a derby for experienced managers who've been at the football club for seasons are difficult, as we know. Yet Joe managed to come in and produce a victory with a team that was bottom of the league.
Yeah, I don't think they were sort of bottom of the table. You know, if you looked at the abilities of all the teams in the Premier League in 94, 95, I think it says, I mean, Joe obviously understood the importance of the derby and the importance of the rivalry and you know, how to get the best results in derby matches. I think he was helped in his tenure as well, to be fair. The fact that I always felt that Liverpool in the mid-90s, I think that's pretty much acknowledged, a bit of a soft touch. You know, had some really good players, but actually, if you got into them, you know, maybe they weren't at the best. So I think, you know, we'd had decent results immediately before Joe, and immediately afterwards. You know, so I think they were a soft touch Liverpool in that time, but Joe knew how to take advantage of that. You know, to press the weaknesses, and it helped because he'd been a player. And this derby record is, I think, is he still? Well, they might have changed recently, obviously. I think he was for years the only unbeaten manager in the derby, wasn't he? I think
he was his entire tenure as Everton manager. He never lost a derby match.
Yeah,
time he was there. It's funny actually because Slaven Bilic was still at the club around about that time. And I remember him, you know, sort of being asked about, you know, so why Everton could somehow turn it on in derby matches when Liverpool always seemed to have better players. And he came out with a great one-liner. He goes, "Yes, they do have better players, but we have more men." And that was exactly right. You know, so in derby matches, Everton did get about them and, you know, unsettled them. And back then it worked, certainly.
Of course, we can't talk about Joe's first season without talking about the FA Cup. Preno, you spoke about him promising Peter Johnson that we'd be playing cup football. And if we look back at the run, 1-0, 1-0, 5-0, 1-0, 4-1, and then 1-0 in the final. I mean, to concede one goal from the third round all the way to Wembley is astonishing.
It is, and that goal was a very, very dubious penalty when Jurgen Klinsmann dived in the semi-final. So, you know, they should have kept clean sheets all the way through. It underlined the kind of football Everton were playing. I mean, like, as Gav said earlier, Joe wanted to strengthen things defensively, which was something that, you know, Mike Walker clearly hadn't done. And I know later he did come to dislike that Dogs of War tag because he thought it was like a stick being used to beat Everton with, whilst it was vital in that season and helped Everton win the FA Cup that season. The following year, when he was trying to expand a little bit, and Everton just missed out on qualifying for Europe and he missed out on the last game of the season, they were playing more expansive football. But, you know, cute managers like Alex Ferguson were still throwing disparaging remarks. And Everton went to Old Trafford and drew 2-2, should have won. And Fergie made this like dismissive comment about Route 1 football. And it was designed in true Ferguson tradition to try and take the attention away from how poorly his own team had performed that day. But Joe didn't like that because it was almost like that was all he was capable of doing, you know, was organising a team that could, you know, so could dig in and battle. And it didn't, you know, so he was a much better coach than that. But certainly the FA Cup campaign, Derby County was the first game, and it was a tight match. Everton won 1-0. Notable because Craig Short played for Derby that day, and Joe spotted him and liked the look of him and brought him into the club, you know, to the following season. But then Bristol City away in the fourth round, that was the day when you really thought, oh, hello, what's going on here? Because we got battered that day, absolutely battered. There'd been a virus going through the squad, and a load of players were really under the weather. John Edward was taken out to the starting lineup just before the kickoff and was sat on the dugout all wrapped up like a mummy. Neville was at his best that day, made all kinds of incredible saves, and then got to about 8 minutes from the end, and we're frantically thankful that we've got a replay when Matt Jackson let fly with this left-footed volley from 25 yards, absolutely leaded one into the top corner. And you just thought, oh, hang on, you know, so maybe something's happened here. You often say that, you know, teams that win the cup, their name is on the cup. And as early as the fourth round, you thought, yes, this could be the year. Because, you know, the fifth round absolutely demolished, you know, so Norwich took them apart 5-0. Quarterfinals was Newcastle, and they were a decent side. You know, so Newcastle under Kevin Keegan, you know, so really, really good, attractive team. And Everton just dug in, got about them. Should have Stuart Barlow, as he was his wont, missed a sitter clean through that day. But, you know, so Waggy actually, you know, so managed to head one in. And Kevin Keegan was very, very grumpy after that match. I remember him coming up to the press conference and just saying, this is all about Joe, not about me. Goodbye. And went straight back downstairs again. He was gutted, absolutely gutted. And then, to underline, you know, why Joe was more than just a manager capable of creating a team not to lose matches, the semi-final against Spurs, when Spurs were massive, you know, sort of media favourites, Everton out-footballed them absolutely battered them 4-1 and played some wonderful football that day. I'll let Gavin talk about that because, you remember it well, don't you, Gav? Joe Parky's dragged back. It was everything about that game was wonderful.
Yeah, it was. I tell you what, Lee Carsey played for Derby County as well, didn't he?
Right,
Yeah, the Spurs game, I think Joe got on record as one of Everton's finest post-war performances, and I'd certainly agree with that. There was a bit of a backstory, though, wasn't it, to the Spurs? We were talking about this the other week, when I was talking about name on the cup. Spurs had been thrown out the competition, or banned from the competition at the start of the season over some administrative issues at White Hart Lane. So they'd actually been thrown out the cup, and then Alan Sugar had sort of fought a battle to get them back in. And so, being back in the cup, and he'd won at Anfield, hadn't he? Spurs in the quarter-final. So, thinking, not only is our name on the trophy, but it's probably, that's a great storyline, isn't it? The team who won the cup haven't been banned, But and you've seen the Spurs team, Sheringham, Barnby, I think, Klinsmann. I think it's going to be a tough game today, but it helped that famously Elland Road was 3 sides with Everton fans, wasn't it? And I think the club had supplied these 2 massive flags before the game, and it felt very much like a home game on a ground that we're not really, got fond memories of.
It was our baby round,
yeah, especially in the cup. And on the day, I mean, at 2-1, you think it's a bit of an injustice, and Neville made the good save, but when you said Joe's cute, and I think he was a bit more cute than what people thought, is they had a young left back whose name was Austin playing left back for them. And Limpar used to play wide left. He put Anders on the right.
Yeah.
And Anders tormented them all game. And they got it back. I think Nev made a good save, didn't he, from Klinsmann at 2-1. And we got into by this stage, we now got into the famous Daniel Amakati substitution. To which my understanding is there's variations of this. Is Paul Rideout went over to on the far side of the pitch in the dugout. Les Elm went to see him. I think Les Elm had a sort of signals to Joe, didn't he? Signal to Joe. I think he put his hand up to say, "I'm going to take that man, take him off the pitch. We'll see how he is." And I think Joe maybe been thinking of bringing Daniel on, and Daniel Amakati had like his substitute slip. Which I think did he get off Jimmy Martin? I think just give it thought that was going off, or maybe not even. Just thought give it to the lad. Just ran on the pitch.
He did his substitute himself. He ran to the fourth official, and you can see Joe coming out of the dugout and sort of waving at him to come back. Yeah. And Daniel had just sort of spoken to the fourth official. Yep, I'm coming on. And that was it. Substituted himself.
Yeah, and as we well know, history tells Daniel scored 2 as a sub. I mean, and to be fair, 4-1 was about the right result in that game because we were far the superior team. And anything less than a sort of 3 or 4 goal margin would have done justice to our performance.
I think I mentioned in a podcast recently about the atmosphere in the press box that day because Elland Road, it was an enclosed press box behind smoked glass. And I remember a couple of the national boys were absolutely convinced it was going to be a Spurs Man United final. And so much so that one of the guys from the Daily Mail, I think it was, had written that morning, I've looked into my crystal ball and never have I been more confident that we'll be seeing a Tottenham versus Manchester United Cup final. So in that press box, we had all like the local lads, myself, Phil McNulty, Vic Gibson, we were all like sort of sat down one end and the national boys were down the other. And as Everton are getting more and more, sort of ahead, we're getting more and more excited. And professional demeanour did go out the window a little bit, I'm afraid to say. Certainly wasn't me, but one of my colleagues, I remember shouting down there the press ranks to the Daily Mail correspondent, "Hey, how's your effing crystal ball looking now?" And it was absolutely wonderful. And then after the game, the post-match press conference, Joe continued with that theme a little bit because he walked in with that little wry smile on his face as he did. He never got really up or really down, Joe. He was always like very, very level-headed. And he just walked in and he says, "Oh, well, gentlemen, sorry about the dream final, but bollocks to you." And that's with a double L. And you can see all like the other lads go, "Oh, no need for that." But we loved it. And the Everton fans loved it as well. It was a truly great day.
It was a great day, though.
I mean, look, Gav, we all remember 95 and the final, but just take us back to, we spoke there, Preno said about the odds were against Everton in the semi-finals. How heavily were the odds stacked in Manchester United's favour with the bookies going into the final?
they were the favourites. There was a couple of things going on there that were in our favour. First, we beat them in February in the league, which we shouldn't underestimate that game in terms of importance. Duncan's famously scored the goal and took the shares off, so that gave a bit of confidence. I think the second thing was that they'd lost the lead the week before, hadn't they? When Blackburn had won and United got beat at West Ham. And I think they had a couple of niggling injuries. There was no Kanchelskis, there was no Giggs, if I remember. Yeah, so I think they had pressure on them to deliver a trophy, plus a few injuries, and that's not necessarily the best. If you've lost the lead the week before, as we well know, it's not the best to be going into a cup final on that basis. You do feel the pressure a bit more. And we developed into, a hard-to-beat team. Joe set the team up at Wembley, I think, not to concede. I mean, he played effectively 2 left-backs on the left-hand side, didn't he? Though we weren't, I wouldn't say we were massively underdogs. United was still the favourite, but it's not like now, where you get a team at the top of the table playing whatever we finished that year, 13, 14. Not like now. The gap was not as great as what you think, and so it proved on the day as well. I think on the day it panned out as you would expect. United under pressure, we were up for it, and momentum's a great thing. And I know you mentioned this, don't you? If you think it's your year, you it gives an extra 5%, doesn't it, to your performance? I think that was reflected.
Yeah, you talk about momentum. I mean, we went into that match having won away at Ipswich on was it Monday night, or Tuesday night? Yeah. And that guaranteed Premier League safety, which meant that we could then go to the final match of the season at Coventry, knowing the pressure was off. We didn't need to get a result. So we went there, drew 0-0. And Duncan hadn't played for about 3 months because he'd had a knee injury, and he was patently, massively unfit. And he came on for the final 45 minutes of that game, came on at half-time in a bid to prove to Joe that he was match fit to be part of the FA Cup squad. And he wasn't. You could tell he was miles off the pace. But Joe had the biggest, hardest decision of his managerial career at Everton, and that was whether to include him in the cup final squad or not to. Eventually, he decided to, because of what you just said there, Gav, because he'd scored the goal in February against United, and psychologically, having him on the bench would have been a massive, sort of plus point in Everton's favour. If United looked across at the bench and saw Duncan there, they didn't know he was unfit. It would have worked in Everton's favour. So Joe had the really difficult decision of telling John Edbrell he couldn't be part of the squad because Daniel Amokachi, days of only 2 outfield substitutes, and Daniel Amokachi was the other one. So he basically tracked him all around the team hotel on the eve of the game until he could find him on his own and said, John, I need to have a conversation with you. And John knew what was coming. So, oh God, no gaffer. And he took it, as well as you can take a decision like that. And Duncan eventually got onto the pitch, and you could tell he was miles off, but he was there purely for the psychological impact he could have on Manchester United. And again, part of Joe's sort of man management technique, he knew that would unsettle United if necessary, and it probably did.
Yeah, I mean, the main memory of the final was thinking, beforehand, it's going to be real blood and thunder, and as you say, dogs of war stuff and all this, which is the game of Goodison in February was a bit like that. But I remember the first half hour; it was quite quiet. There was really nothing happening. There was a couple of tackles, but it wasn't like you would expect from a cup final. And it wasn't what you would expect from an Manchester United game. And then I don't know why. It wasn't Fergie's greatest day as a manager. I think he made a couple of bad decisions. The first one was with I think Steve Bruce done his hamstring, didn't he? After about 15 minutes, and I think rather than take him off, he kept him on. And at half hour, I think it was half hour mark, whatever it was, I don't know why, but they massively overloaded their forward line, didn't they? And then we broke on the right hand side. Matt Jackson got to the edge of the penalty area, squared it. Graham Stewart, thankfully for what happened next, probably missed one of the great Wembley chances. And I think he came down and. You really underestimate Paul Rideout's header. That from a standing jump, from ball with not a lot of pace on it, to get that much sort of traction and momentum on the ball from that position took a lot of effort and experience. And Steve Bruce was on the line. Steve Bruce didn't jump, did he? Because he was injured. And Peter Schmeichel was going mad afterwards. And I don't think it was Fergie's Fergie's finest hour. And he ends up, Roy Keane, who's the most expensive midfielder in Britain. Yeah, he messed it about so much. They ended up playing Roy Keane at right back for the second half. Yeah. And so that helped us as well that day. Everything, like when you win the cup, everything always seems to go in your favour, doesn't it? Bad decision from the other team, you get a little bit of luck and stuff. And you really underrate that finish by Ridehouse, and he got Graham Stewart out of jail.
Totally. It wasn't a great final. If you think back to it, not a great deal happened, but no one's bothered. So when you end up winning the cup at the end of it, you talk about there not being much in the way of sort of frantic tackling and anything, and there wasn't. But the goal itself actually came from a little bit of dogged tackling on the edge of the penalty area. Dave Watson just dug in. And I think was it Paul Ince he was up against? I can't remember, but he had this sort of real dogged, sort of attempt to win the ball, won it, and it broke through for Matt, who then so went on that long run. And then Matt and that long run in support. And Diamond, he wasn't gutted about it, because of what happened subsequently. But he should have buried it.
I remember the second half. I remember the second half expecting an onslaught. It never really happened to me. I think Nev made a double save, didn't he? And one real Hollywood save to his right. Can't remember.
That was it. Nev got all kinds of plaudits that game. And that was one of his quieter games. He'll admit that himself. And he showboated a little bit, so with a couple of the saves. One of them he made with his legs. But they were the kind of saves you expect Nev to make all the time. They weren't, so absolutely stunning stops.
Yeah, there was a great battle with Unzi and Mark Hughes in that game.
No, absolutely. Unzi came of age in that game. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it was great. Well, I always remember Waggy, somebody tweeted the other week, is Dave Watson an Everton legend?
How do you ask the question? Yeah, exactly.
Why are you asking that question? He's one of the few living legends we've got, and he was magnificent in that cup run. He was brilliant at Newcastle. The Newcastle game was fantastic. Yeah. Waggy was fully deserved to lift the FA Cup. He'd obviously played in the mid-80s, but that was his moment, wasn't it, really? And I was really pleased for Waggy. He's the top man, top blue. Even though he started at Liverpool, obviously. That was his day, that. And I always, when I look back on that, I always think Waggy, because he's just a legend, and what a player and character we were lucky to have there.
Very quickly then, just one word answer from each of you. Who was man of the match that day?
I think the official man of the match was Waggy, wasn't it? Was it Dave Watson?
Well, I can't remember. Who was your man of the match?
I would have said Unzi. I thought he had a tremendous game.
I'd have personally gone for Unzi, I think either Waggy or Neville probably got it that day, but I'd have gone for Unzi personally as well,
Okay. Well, Joe had managed the incredible feat of keeping us up and then winning the FA Cup. What were the expectations going into 95-96?
Well, I remember I did an interview with Peter Johnson after that game. And he spoke about, the Everton are in a false position. We're going to invest in the squad. We're going to give Joe Royle money to spend. And, we want to be aiming for Europe. So that was it, from having been literally that close to being relegated the following season, the pressure was back on again. So Everton were expected to be qualifying for Europe. And God bless him, Joe, missed out on the last match of the season. We were playing Villa at home. We did our bit and won 1-0. Arsenal were playing Bolton, I think it was, and they were losing 1-0. But then Dennis Bergkamp scored 2 in the last 10 minutes, and so Arsenal just pipped us. So we finished 6th in the end. But it was an incredible turnaround. And of course, that was the season where Joe had bought Andrei Kanchelskis from Manchester United. A long drawn out affair. Middlesbrough were trying to sign him as well. So it was a battle with Brian Robson, so his old teammate, to buy him. Then United were trying to, sort of push the boat out financially. Then there were all kinds of issues with Shakhtar Donetsk, who we played for previously, all kinds of clauses in the contract that needed ironing out. So it took a long time to finally get him into the club. And then sod's law, he played one game and injured his shoulder and was missing for like a couple of months, or a month or so. But when he finally did get into the team and hit the ground running, what a player. So arguably the most, sort of impressive player, sort of the modern era at Everton. I always remember one pre-season friendly at Wrexham where I think he scored 4 goals. And footballers, so as is their nature, they're very self-deprecating and they take the mickey out of each other, something rotten, and they'll never tell another footballer how good they are. They always like to bring them down to earth. And they all came out of the dressing room that day up the race course, and they were just shaking their heads as they were walking past me, going, "Oh my God, how good was he? How good was Andrei? How good was he?" And he was absolutely a phenomenon that season. It was just a shame it was only a one-season wonder because he basically disappeared into his shell the following season. But for that 95-96 season, he was like a force of nature.
Gav, if I remember, 16 league goals that season for Andrei. Our colleague Adam Jones actually put out a bit of a poll on Twitter the other day asking fans for the signing they were most excited about at the time. And of course, a lot of fans of a certain era mentioned Lukaku joining permanently, but quite a lot mentioned Andrei. Can you sort of sum up the excitement and why did Manchester United agree to sell him?
Well, that's a good question. I think that's somewhere in '95. I mean, we have to talk about Stan Collymore there because somebody asked us to on Twitter.
Yeah, of course.
We talk about ambition. There was a lot of ambition, as I say, Peter Johnson, and I think in the June, Collymore was going to be leaving Nottingham Forest, and the choice was Everton or Liverpool, if you remember.
Yeah.
And I think, if I remember, I think we were offering more money.
We were. I mean, I can throw a little bit of insight into this because Joe was very, very upset with the media at the time for Stan, so ended up going to Liverpool. And I think that was Joe overreacting a little bit because, Stan Collymore had the choice between Everton and Liverpool. And the Daily Post, as was the morning newspaper, whilst he was still making up his mind, carried a story. Some university academic had been interviewed, and he talked about racism in English football and why Everton were commonly known to be, a racist football club. Yeah. Because, we'd had that issue for a long time where we hadn't bought, black players. Daniel Amakachi had broken that trend, but he was one of the few. And, for whatever reason, the Daily Post carried the story that day. And Joe went ballistic. Joe thought that would influence Stan Collymore in his thinking. I don't think it did. I don't even know if Stan Collymore was aware of the Daily Post's existence. No. But I just think it was a toss-up between Everton and Liverpool, and he wanted to go to Liverpool. I think he thought the possibility of winning trophies.
I think the story at the time was that I think because he played at England on the 21 level, whatever. I think he was mates, wasn't he, with some of what are now known as the Spice Boys.
Yeah.
I think that those people that he was subsequently became friendly with or was pictured with it at Anfield, he was already mates with them, and I think that was one of the aspects to it, that he knew he would be going into a dressing room that he knew at Anfield. And that shows you the ambition, because Stan was a British record today, wasn't it?
$8.5 million, yeah. I mean, Joe wanted to pair him with Duncan Ferguson, and he always said, imagine those two up front together. And on the days that they clicked, they would be, what they used to say at the time, absolutely unplayable. But you'd also get plenty of afternoons where they were going through the motions and maybe weren't at it. But, like, for example, the Newcastle United game at the start of that season, when Alan Shearer was making his debut for Newcastle, 15 million quid. And Everton bid for Alan Shearer as well. That was a sign of the club's ambition. It was madness because Newcastle had bid 15 million and Everton went in and bid 12. Work that one out if you can. Yeah. Where's he going to end up going to? But anyway, so Duncan had his nose put out of joint a little bit that Alan Shearer was getting all this publicity and all this media attention, and he'd been wandering around Belfield all week singing this mad little song about Alan Shearer, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but basically he wanted to outshine Alan Shearer that day, and boy did he! He had an absolutely inspired afternoon. Everton won 2-0, so he created both goals. It was just so Duncan at his absolute best. So imagine him and Stan Collymore at their best in the same team. On the day they clicked, wow.
I think that was Joe's problem, wasn't it? After '95, was the fact that he wanted to get a striker in, but I think he, as you say, Collymore. He was after David Hurst as well, Sheffield Wednesday. He was always bidding for Mark Hughes, who'd gone to Chelsea. If you remember, Prano, we went over to Italy to look at George Weah as well when George was playing for Milan, and he never quite got. He never got that striker because 95, 96, of course, Duncan, as we know, was served whatever it was in prison and stuff and missed half the campaign. So if we'd have got a striker, then that would have made a difference maybe for us, getting into Europe again in at the end of 95, 96 season. And I remember in 96 as well, there was a bit of a convoluted story that if Shearer went to Man United, they'll sell Andy Cole to us. But I remember that day, that Newcastle game, because we bought Gary Speed, hadn't we?
Yeah.
In the summer. And I think Speed scored and Duncan was unplayable on a really roast hot day. And then the sort of, it was a bit of a strange campaign, that wasn't it, 96, 97. It's peaks and troughs. What I remember about that is you know, we talk about long ball. I remember you saying, got beat 4-0 at Wimbledon, didn't we, right at the start of the season? And afterwards, saying, like, one of the managers was saying, they just knocked the ball long to the big man, you know, up top, and we just made sure we got the second ball. And that wasn't like Joe Royle talking about Wimbledon. It was Wimbledon talking about Everton, you know, Joe Mayer. And we'd had a really few injuries. We'd won, then never won for 7 or 8 games. We got knocked out. I think we was it York City that year or Millwall. We got beat in the League Cup, and we had a couple of bad defeats at Port Vale in the FA Cup, hadn't we? And Joe got a bit uppity, I think, with a few people. And then all of a sudden, as we well know, then 96, 97, we start on this run, don't we, from about October 96. Where we signed Barbie, we beat Southampton 7-1. We win a few away games. I think we won a derby, didn't we, just before Christmas. All of a sudden, with dark horses for the title, you know, on Sky. I think we beat Derby on Sky, didn't we? Nick Barbie scored, and Andy Gray was saying, these are dark horses for the title. They're a very difficult team to beat.
I remember that very, very well. Yeah, I mean, the 96-97 season, it had been a mixed campaign, but we had that great run. And you're right, it was Joe Park. He shot from 20 yards, came off the crossbar, and Barbie put it in with his nose. And Nick Barbie had been a club record transfer signing, 5.75 million. So, you know, they were certainly spending money. But you're right, it was Richard Keys and Andy Gray who basically said that, Everton have got to be considered dark horses to win the league. And what was significant about that is that nobody mocked. Everybody said, yeah, you're right, you're absolutely spot on. And from that point, on Boxing Day against Leeds, Andy Hinchcliffe, who was very, very important to that team for his set-piece delivery, for his sort of balance down the left, he did his cruciate knee ligament and was out for the rest of the season. Joe Parkinson at Middlesbrough 2 days later did his knee, an injury which basically cost him his career. So he was very important, and his career effectively ended that day. He had a couple of attempted comebacks which never really worked out. And then Dave Watson got injured, not long term, but enough to keep him out for a couple of games, and he was important as well. And so a little wobble started just then. And the wobble lasted for 2 or 3 months. And you're right, I mean, Joe started getting flack in the media, so notably a couple of my colleagues at the Echo, and he didn't react very, very well to it at all. And, so it went into lockdown a little bit. But Peter Johnson, crucially, used to listen, to everybody, and he'd take, readings from, all over the media. And he started, putting a bit of pressure on Joe. And he got to that point whereby Joe wanted to sign 2 players on transfer deadline day in March. Andre Flo, who was a very, very good striker, ended up going to Chelsea and doing very, very well there. And a make-weight in the deal from Brambergen was a fellow called Klaus Efterwaag, who was a central defender. It was basically to replace Waggy for the times when Waggy, wasn't fit. And it was never, I mean, Johnson wasn't particularly happy about the deal. I think he thought Efterwaag was hopeless. Again, as we said in the previous podcast, so club hierarchy making decisions on players who they shouldn't sign. And he thought Andre Flo was overpriced. And so we got that situation. He tried to sign goalkeepers as well, Nigel Martin, because Joe had made it perfectly clear he wanted to replace Neville. He thought Neville, finally, great servant though he'd been, time was right to replace him. He brought in Paul Gerrard, who was never quite good enough to replace Neville. But he tried to sign Nigel Martin. I know Peter Johnson and Cliff Finch managed to screw that one up. He tried
to sign Marcus Walter as well, didn't he?
Was another one. And yes, again, that one was fouled up. And so Joe was having frustrations in the transfer market with Johnson. And he went across the day he went. I'd seen him at Goodison that morning, and they were announcing a number of cup competition for the following season's pre-season with Chelsea, Ajax and Newcastle. And Joe had been there, he winked at me during the end of the press conference, walked out. And everything was absolutely fine. What we didn't know, he was then going over to Park Foods to meet Peter Johnson. And Desmond Pitcher, one of the deputy chairman, I think he was, had been speaking to Peter earlier in the day, and had said this, hello, I believe he's seeing Joe later. I believe he's coming over to offer his resignation. No one knows why Desmond Pitcher said that. But Johnson is in his office, because Joe certainly wasn't. Joe walks in, and Peter Johnson's opening gambit was, hello, Joe. I believe you're coming to offer my resignation. Now, talk about putting the man off his guard. So Joe's like, no, where'd you get that from? You don't want me to, do you? And the pair of them basically started having this conversation where it quickly became clear that Joe didn't have the total confidence of Peter Johnson. And in about the space of about an hour and a half, they agreed that he was going to leave the club and be mutually consented. Now, the big dynamic here is that Cliff Finch, who was Peter Johnson's right-hand man, was away at the time. I think he was in the Caribbean or something. And Joe subsequently said, if Cliff had been there, he'd have just said to the pair of them, what are you doing? Behave yourselves, knock their heads together and just, let's go on with things. We've had a bad run. Let's just go on with things. But they didn't. Joe was listening to Desmond Pitcher, listening to some of the things that were being written in the media, and thought it was a good idea to make this change. So a man who transformed the football club in the space of, 2.5 years, and admittedly a 2.5-month rocky spell, was suddenly the former Everton manager. It was absolute madness. It really was.
Yeah, we'd had a terrible run now, hadn't we? And there was a few things going on. I think one of the things Johnson, I believe, was that Joe wanted to sign Barry Orme back, didn't he?
Yeah.
From Birmingham. And he thought that maybe it looked like a backward step, that it wouldn't look great. It's a great story where Barry Orme thought he was going to Everton. And was Trevor Francis the manager of Birmingham then? So he started slagging Trevor Francis off. Because he thought he was going to Everton, and it fell through, wasn't it?
Well, that was it. Joe after he'd been mutually consented, tried to get hold of Barry to say, look, mate, I'm sorry, but it's all off now. You haven't spoken to Trevor yet, have you? And Barry's like, oh, my God, yes, I've just been to see him. So, yeah.
But you can see why. I mean, I may be slightly unpopular opinion this, but I love Joe, and obviously a big Everton fan. But to me, Joe was a bit like Gordon Lee, where you come in for a couple of years, and then when you come to shape a team in your own style and your own tactics and your own vision, I'm not sure. You would argue that he never got the chance, really, to be fair. But I think a lot of this quiet was, and you touched on this, I think, in the last pod, Dave, was by the mid-90s, the Premier League was now become the Premier League. It seemed like a new competition, didn't it? So in the mid-90s, you had clubs like Middlesbrough bringing in Ravanelli, Janino, had Spurs, Arsenal. They were very much our equals at the time. Yeah. Bringing in obviously Vieira and Bergkamp and stuff like that. And I think the disquiet with supporters was, well, why aren't we bringing players in like that? Obviously we've spoken in many respects. What we've spoken about here is part of the problem. Is we were bidding for players, but they wouldn't come to us, would they?
Well, you talk about Bergkamp, and I heard a story at the time, and I can't, sort of say with any degree of certainty that it was true or not, but certainly Cliff Finch and Peter Johnson suggested that they'd pitched Dennis Bergkamp, the idea of Dennis Bergkamp to Joe. Whether he'd have come or not, I don't know, but Joe dismissed it, and Joe said that no, he was past his best. That may or may not be true, I don't know, but certainly there was a conflict between the powers that be and Joe over the type of players that they should be bringing in. But no, I think it was a massive backward step, sort of getting rid of Joe the way they did, and the time.
I think he would probably give him another year, but I can see why. We'd taken 9 points from 14 games, something like that. We were sliding towards the abyss again. We obviously described with Kanchelskis, wasn't it? That caused a lot of upset in the changing room, hadn't it, for the morale of the team the first half of the year. I mean, there was rumours that having bought Barnby, he was going to sell. Remember, there was a bad defeat at Newcastle, wasn't it, where he dropped Barnby, never got dropped in for the first time since the 5-0. And you just got the impression behind the scenes things weren't great. So you can fully understand why there had to be a conversation between Johnson and Joe Royle. But maybe it shouldn't have been that outcome. But I could see why supporters were unhappy. And we got knocked out of the FA Cup, hadn't we, by Bradford.
Correct. That was my worst moment reporting on Everton that afternoon. It was absolutely horrendous because the atmosphere was just so toxic and so poisonous around the place. But I think Joe was a victim of his own success, because we look at how bad the team had been under Mike Walker, and he transformed it almost miraculously by the click of his fingers. But clearly the club needed changing from top to bottom. The squad needed rebuilding. And because he'd achieved success very, very quickly, people lost sight of that a little bit and realised that so maybe things aren't quite as bad as they are. And they were. And, it needed a major, reshuffle, a major squad rebuild. And unfortunately, he was never really given the opportunity to do that. He brought in, sort of one or two individuals, but, certainly the entire squad. As we talked about, the goalkeeper needed changing. There were sort of other significant members, and the centre forward was needed. He never really got the opportunity to do it.
Just before we move on to post Joe and Waggy taking over, just want to roll back very quickly. In the sort of afterglow of the FA Cup final win, of course, was a return to Europe. Didn't last very long, but what was that experience like for Joe and for the team?
I absolutely adored it, so as an experience. But it was weird because that was the era, if you remember, when you couldn't play more than, I think it was, you had to have at least 5, sort of domestic nationals in your starting lineup. So, and for that purposes, Barry Horn counted as a foreigner because he was Welsh. So Neville Southall because he was Welsh. You were only allowed, a certain number of, sort of foreign players. So there was a bit of a balancing act to have to, play them. So, we drew KR Reykjavik in the opening round of the Cup Winners' Cup, which was great experience. They weren't a particularly good side. It gave us a couple of little scares. We won 3-2 away, beat them 3-1 at Goodison, I think. But it was, fairly comfortable. It was just a great experience of following Everton into Europe. That was the era when Barry Horn couldn't play, and he was left at home. And Andy Hinchcliffe, when we were in Iceland, had bet me. He says, "Come on, so I bet you, I'll give you a phrase you've got to try and get into your match report." And I said, "Oh God, go on. I wonder what's coming up here." Anyway, he told me I had to get the words "barren tundra" into the match report. So it was easy enough to do. So I just talked about the barren tundra of KR Reykjavik's pitch, which was actually quite decent. I remember Barry pulling me, so when I got back home, saying, "What were you talking about, barren tundra? Your match report? That pitch looked quite decent." I said, "Yeah, it was, to be fair. It was just a joke with Andy." But that was, the relationship we had back then with the club, so we were allowed to travel with the players, so I was quite close to a few of them. And it was a great dynamic. So, so travelling to Iceland was great. And then we drew Feyenoord, they were a decent side in the next round. They had Reggie Blinker playing for the Henrik Larsson, so it basically became a legend at Celtic, was playing for them.
And the future Everton manager.
Yeah, Ronald Koeman, of course, centre back, who got Craig Short sent off in the second leg. But we did okay. We got beat at home 1-0, but then went over there, performed particularly well, but then conceded another, and that was it. That was effectively the end of it. It was a frustrating, European campaign for as long as it lasted. But it was just great to see Everton back in Europe again and actually playing games like that.
Indeed. Okay, well, Gav, I'm going to come back to you now. So, Waggy takes over for the final 6 or 7 games of that season. Was the name Howard Kendall in the public domain? Was it on people's lips going into that summer, or was it a surprise to see Howard return?
I think 1990 was a surprise. I think 97. I think Preno will probably remember this more than me. I think Peter Johnson said we'll be getting a world-class manager.
Correct.
It was the phrase he used in about when, I think just after Joe had been, whatever you would say, mutually, mutually contract ended, whatever. Well, talk about talking big. Waggy, we may never go down, but we weren't certainly 100% certain staying up. I think we won and drew a couple of games. So we stayed up. I think it started off Johan Cruyff, Bobby Robson, who I think there was a conversation with Bobby Robson about it when Bobby was at Barcelona. Not the first Everton I've ever had with Bobby Robson, to be fair.
Correct.
And then, if I remember, there was this odd one, wasn't it? Klinsmann was linked because I think he was talking about finishing his career. And then we spoke to Martin O'Neill. And then we had this, you talk about, there must have been a lot of unclear conversations that went on with Peter Johnson. The Joe and Peter Johnson conversation now becomes the Andy Gray Peter Johnson conversation in the summer of 1997. Because I tell you what, a hell of a lot went out Park Foods, didn't it? Because I think Andy went over there, didn't he?
You had a conversation with Joe, and Peter Johnson had a conversation with Andy, and at the end of the conversation, Peter Johnson was convinced he'd offered Andy Gray the job, and Andy Gray was equally convinced he hadn't been offered the job.
Yeah.
It was completely surreal situation.
it was all unclear, wasn't it? I think Andy went away. I think he even got his backroom staff together, didn't he? And sort of said, and then I think Andy then subsequently said that, well, nothing was forthcoming. Sky were obviously getting a bit worried about what was going on, so Andy got a nice new contract off Sky, and he rethought his options, and then stayed where he was. I always think that was a great opportunity missed. I think that would have been a really interesting appointment. I think Andy would have, understood the Premier League, the way the game was going, knew the club. I think that would have been a very, very good combination. And then all of a sudden, Howard had gone to Sheffield United, had done a really good job, hadn't he? Got into the playoff finals, Wembley, lost in the last minute to Crystal Palace, I think. Then all of a sudden, we get a position where Howard is offered the job for the third time, which was seemed unbelievably when he started off the sequence looking at Johan Cruyff and Bobby Robson. Now on Howard Mark III.
It was a completely surreal period again. As much of Peter Johnson's tenure as Everton chairman was, I mean, the end of that season underlined how badly Everton needed to rebuild and restructure. You think of some of the players that Waggy actually ended up playing. I think he introduced Richard Dunn into the team then. John Hills played at the end of the last half of the season against Chelsea. He played Paul Rideout in central midfield against Tottenham in a game that we needed to win to basically guarantee Premier League safety with 3 or 4 games to go. And Paul Rideout had agreed a deal to go to China. And Waggy said, no, you're not going, so I need you for this game. And I remember getting a phone call that night at home from Paul Rideout's missus, who I didn't know, basically, so asking me to put pressure in print on the manager to let him go and join China because he was ruining things for their family. And I said, I haven't got that kind of influence. I can't do that, I'm afraid. Anyway, Waggy dug his heels in, actually, so played Paul at centre mid. And he was magnificent, absolute testimony to his professionalism and his ability as a footballer. He basically dictated the game that day. Gary Speed scored the winner with a diving header down the street end. We won 1-0, and that was it. Paul could then leave. And he actually left on the back of a motorbike from Goodison Park straight after the game. Not quite still in his kit, but as good as to try and make a flight from Manchester Airport to get to China. So, we had all that, having to, sort of put square pegs into round holes at the end of that season. Then you had the constant ongoing about a world-class manager, and I think you'd be pleasantly surprised. And boy, were we surprised. So when basically, I think because he'd been let down by so many other individuals, I think he finally went for one man that he knew would definitely say yes regardless. And that was Howard, because Howard adored the club so much. He knew that Howard would come back, and Howard did. But 97, 98 should never have happened. I mean, that is one of the most unpleasant seasons that we've ever had as a football club. It was a dreadful season from start to finish. And I just wish it never happened. Unfortunately, it did.
Well, look, in the interests of time, because we're well on, let's just try and skip right to the final day, because that is the season effectively, isn't it? In many respects, Coventry, May the 10th. Gav, can you just set the scene for us a little bit, and what were your hopes going in?
Absolute panic, I'd say. It's been a dreadful campaign. There've been very little redeeming features apart from 4 points against Liverpool. We got beaten badly at Arsenal on the preceding Sunday, I think, where we looked a shocking team, and unlike '94, things are out of our hands because I think it was us and Bolton. So Bolton went into the last game of the season, going to Chelsea, points ahead of us. Which the irony being, which is always relevant to the final day, is it had been the away game of Bolton early on in the season, where the teams had drawn 0-0, but Bolton had a goal. The ball had crossed over the line, we wouldn't have needed goal line technology to rule on it. It was quite blatantly over the line. So if they win that,
equally Neville was fouled. So
yeah. Anyway. So we go into the final day. Coventry with a decent team and the good second. They had a lot of good players, Huckabee, Dion Dublin, that type of stuff. Good team. And you're looking at our lineup, and I think if I remember, I'm not sure Gareth Farley was in Howard's original plans. I think Howard changed his mind overnight, didn't he? and said that he fancied him, he'd not scored, and put him in. And then it's not like '94. This is something. It's out of our hands to a degree. And fortunately for us, we scored early on. I think Chelsea scored reasonably early on, or whatever. And so it was more about what happened at Chelsea to a degree. But it was panic. For me, it was far more. It was worse than '94 for the start, because we had a much worse team than '94. We had some good players in '94, but '98, if you have a look at that team, with all due respect, and I mean, there's a couple of really good, like Michael Ball was playing, wasn't he? Really good player, but there's a lot of players there you think I'm not so sure about this. Coventry are decent, so panic would be my word to use there, Phil.
Well, it was an absolutely horrible atmosphere, that, because the fans were starting to turn on the chairman quite significantly then. There'd been chants during the season when we got beat at home by Tottenham, the first chance of "We want Johnson House, we want Johnson House." It was a really sort of nasty atmosphere. And going into that game, it was absolutely horrendous. You mentioned Michael Ball, and the one thing that actually strikes me about that game, because Chelsea, if you remember, they had a European Cup Winners' Cup final only 3 days later. After that Bolton game, they were playing. This was a Sunday afternoon. They were playing on the Wednesday in a European Cup Winners' Cup final. So that was the fear. Chelsea are going to basically change their team, and they're going to just take it nice and easy. So they're not going to be like taking things so particularly seriously. Fortunately, they were very, very professional, and beat Bolton 2-0 that day. But I don't know. I can't remember when it was that so the first goal had gone in. We were leading 1-0, and then obviously a goal had gone in down at Stamford Bridge. And I remember Duncan Ferguson running over to the touchline, because like a roar had gone round the crowd, and then you get these false roars all the time, don't you? You don't know what's going on. And Duncan had gone over and was asking a fan what's happened, and the fan was obviously appearing to tell him, so yes, so Chelsea are winning, turning round to try and transmit that information to the players. And Michael Ball, who must have been about 18 or 19 at the time, was stood in the middle of the pitch screaming at these much more experienced teammates and pointing at his temples, shouting, "Focus, focus." And it was basically, forget what's going on elsewhere, just concentrate on this game. And that was the moment to me. I thought, wow, we've got a young player here, so we got a young man who knows, so what it's all about. But it was, we couldn't even look after ourselves that day. We couldn't even beat Coventry. Obviously, Thomas Myra, who was a decent goalkeeper, and Dion Dublin, we all know his part in Everton's history. A looping, long-range header slipped through his hands. Actually, prior to that, it was 1-0, and we got a penalty. I think it shouldn't have been a penalty. I think, Danny Cadamartri dived over a challenge. Nick Barmby took it, and it was a poor penalty. So they saved it. So it's still only 1-0. And then I still, again, remember the atmosphere when Thomas Myra let that header slip through his hands, and you think, because it was a really wet day, you're thinking, oh my God, no, it's going to be one of those days. Anyway, we got 1 point, they got none, and somehow we stayed up on goal difference.
Because it was a bit more complicated than that, I think, because when they went 1-1 at Goodison, it was still only 1-0 at Stamford Bridge. So Bolton then were back into the thing where they've only got a score to stay up rather than win. And if you ever watch that game, when it goes to 1-1 at Goodison, all the Chelsea fans start supporting Bolton at Stamford Bridge.
Oh no!
It's all mad, because there was another game to Chelsea. They got the Cup Winners' Cup final, and I think it was Josie Morris scored. I think down there, right near the end. Then just became a case of what happened to Goodison. It was a bit petrifying, to say the least. And it was a different emotion, I think, in '98 to what it was in '94. '94 was relief, but I think '98 there was anger. It was more anger, wasn't it? I think in '98 rather than '94.
The final whistle. I mean, because people's emotions were shredded. I mean, there's that famous picture that was carried in the Echo on the Monday of the Everton fan, middle-aged man, stood in the streets outside Goodison Park after the final whistle, crying his eyes out just because the emotion had just got to him so much. And we actually tracked him down, and he was massively embarrassed and didn't want his picture in the paper. But, and Brian LeBone was pictured just wandering around the streets after he couldn't watch the end of the game. He left the stadium, he just started pacing the streets on his own. It was a horrible atmosphere. And when the final whistle went, it was instant, we want Johnson out. It was anger. It was nasty. And then we had that horrible situation of Howard basically on death row for a couple of months, because it was the World Cup summer. And everyone knew that Howard was going to get sacked, and yet Peter Johnson hadn't made the decision. And actually, he flew to meet Peter Johnson at his holiday home in Italy and left still as the Everton manager. even though he knew he was going to sack him, but hadn't. And eventually it was during the World Cup. I think he was basically trying to make sure he got somebody lined up this time, as he hadn't done previously, so he didn't leave himself, so short again. But to treat a club legend like that, and a man as loved as Howard Kendall in that manner, left a sour taste. And I think it was difficult for Peter Johnson to come back after that.
Yeah, I think Howard was actually on holiday himself, wasn't he? He got called off his holiday to go to Johnson's holiday place, and had another Joe Royle type and Andy Gray type conversation, Yeah. Anyway, bad day.
In Walter Smith, did Peter Johnson get the man he wanted?
He did. I mean, Walter was a much sought after manager there that summer. He'd done incredible things at Glasgow Rangers, and so created some teams that had done really well in Europe as well. And Sheffield Wednesday was the club that I think he'd had conversations with Sheffield Wednesday first, and had agreed to go there when Peter Johnson got wind of the fact that so he was available, and so jumped in, so made an offer. And best will in the world, despite the trials and tribulations that had existed at Everton. Everton were a much bigger name than Sheffield Wednesday at the time, a much more attractive prospect, and Sir Walter agreed to sort of change, sort of tack on route and become the Everton manager. Also, probably helped in part by the fact that it had been promised this, what do we call them nowadays, transfer war chest.
That's a phrase that's disappeared out the footballing lexicon. That needs to be revisited, I think.
Well, it was certainly there that summer. And Peter Johnson had basically promised him, so unlimited funds to spend on players. So Walter, so quite naively in retrospect, went ahead and spent. Did the old Viv Nicholson spend thing, and he bought some really good players in. Olivier Dacour was a superb player. John Collins was very good. Marco Materazzi ended up becoming sort of World Cup winner. Ibrahima Bakayoko was one of the, wasn't a success, but so it was quite an exciting signing at the time. Steve Simonson was bought from Tranmere. It was advertised at the time as a world record transfer fee for a goalkeeper of 3.3 million, which was utter nonsense because Peter Johnson had a foot in both camps. Obviously, I think we actually parted with 500 grand in the end. I think Simonson needed to play for England like 100 times to make it 3.3 million quid. But it was an exciting time at Everton because we had a new manager, we were bringing in new players. What we didn't know at the time is the club didn't have that money, and Peter Johnson was basically borrowing or allowing the club to borrow to fund this transfer splurge. And then we ended up having that horrible situation, so not that long into Walter's tenure, of the chairman selling centre forwards behind the manager's back to try and keep the banks at bay, and Duncan Ferguson joined Newcastle. So what very, very quickly started off was quite an exciting period, went bleak very, very quickly.
It is. I was saying to Phil before we came on air. I said I was in the press box that night we played Newcastle.
Yeah.
And the first time I've ever been in the press box, and I remember seeing Rudd Hullet on the stairs, acting suspiciously. Yeah. And I've since learned, and that was what I think Walter got interviewed after by Sky, who said Fergus is going to Newcastle. Don't really, and Walter genuinely didn't know, and then there was stuff in the following 24 hours where Walter may have left, and that was the story. Yeah. And I do remember you saying, I can't remember you told me or read that, wasn't it the editor of the Echo couldn't believe that an Everton manager would know one of his players had been sold? Well,
yeah, at the time it was a very, very bizarre situation. Duncan was walking down the staircase was walking up the staircase as Walter and Archie were coming down with their respective wives. Duncan had been suspended or injured, wasn't playing in that game. And as he passed the manager, he said, "I thought you might have stuck up for me, Gaffer." And Walter, "Stuck up for you? What are you talking about?" He says, "Well, I've signed for Newcastle." "You've what?" He says, "Have you signed anything?" "Well, no, I haven't, but I've shaken hands on a deal." So he turns to Archie, "What are we going to do?" They go down to the referee's room, which is next to the changing room, in the tunnel there, with their respective wives. I said, "What are we going to do?" Anyway, dear old Janice Knox pipes up, during the conversation. He goes, "Well, Archie, I've been in the lounge upstairs, and if what they're saying up there is true, it sounds like Everton have hatched a very, very good deal for Duncan." Archie turns around, and I won't use the language that so he used to his wife, but Janice, shut the F up. Anyway, Ethel Smith jumps in and says, "Oh, Archie, you can't talk to Janice like that." Anyway, the whole thing, deteriorated, and so they agreed to go and meet elsewhere. But yeah, I'd gone into work the following day, and Tony Story was the acting editor that day. Tony Story was the old business editor of the Echo. And when I told him the story, he refused to believe it. I don't think he could believe that a reputable business could run a business in that fashion. And he says, no, he must have known. The manager must have known. The Echo's editorial policy will be that he knew. So I go down to Belfield to see Walter, and I said, look, Walter, I'm awfully sorry, but my gaffer doesn't think that, so you were unaware of it. He thought that you must have known. And I'll tell you what, if Walter didn't know, he's an Oscar-winning actor because he went ballistic. You sit there, son. You're not leaving this office till I've got that. I won't use the phrase he used for Peter Johnson on the phone. And you've heard him tell you that I didn't know anything about it. Anyway, he's banging on his phone. And quite understandably, Peter's not picking up his mobile. He's not picking up his house phone. He's not picking up his phone on his yacht. Walter's getting angrier and angrier. And in the end, I said, look, I believe you, Walter. I believe you. I'll go and tell Tony that you didn't know anything about it. So I did. Fortunately, so Tony accepted my point of view. And we had that ridiculous situation where myself and Paul Joyce, who worked for the Daily Post at the time, now works for the Times, Joycey, and we were both very close to Walter. And we were due to go out that week on the Thursday and for a meal. And, we just thought, well, that's it. It's going to be, so put on ice. We're not going to be going out now. And Walter says, no, we'll still go out. He goes, I might not be manager of Everton Football Club, but we'll definitely go out. So we went out to a place called the Left Bank on Smithdown Road. And had this great night out on the Thursday. And you can imagine some of the insight we were getting onto what was going on behind the scenes then. So I wrote a piece the following morning for the Footy Echo where I branded the chairman of the Everton Football Club blundering, inept, and crass. And you can imagine where a lot of that source material came from. It was a very, very bizarre week. I think Peter Johnson did finally quit the week after that, and he had to. Yeah. I think his position had become untenable.
I think just as a balance there, remember there was an AGM around that time. I remember. But Peter, he provided the information that we'd spent more than any other club over a 4-year period, hadn't we? So, yeah. I mean, to be fair to Peter, he had given Everton managers a comparatively large amount of money to spend.
But they just had to sell it.
You could argue that some of the purchases weren't that great. Yeah. But yeah, Decor was a great purchase. Materazzi was, he was still winning the Champions League 12 years after joining Everton. Yeah. The only problem with that season is that we could score goals, could we? I think it was February before we scored the league goal at the season. It was something mad, wasn't it?
It was absolutely absurd. If you think about it, we had 7 goalless draws that season. 6 of them at Goodison. Imagine going to Goodison and seeing 6 goalless draws. Yeah. And it was because, Walter wanted to do, to a lesser degree, what Joe had done and shore things up defensively. And he often played 5 at the back. He often played 3 central defenders, but the counter to that was we never looked like scoring goals. And we finally broke that duck in bizarre fashion. We put 5 past Middlesbrough, and it was just so where did that come from? Where did that performance suddenly come from?
Yeah, I remember that game. Scored after 40 seconds, didn't we? I think. But around that time, Phil, as well. I mean, Walter, to be fair, bought a good place. He bought Davy Weir then, didn't he?
Yeah.
So that first season, that was 7 goalless draws, not great. And we get to Easter, don't we? We got beaten the Derby on the Saturday. The course scored, didn't he? We go to Easter Monday. We got beaten at home. Was it Aston Villa or 2-1, something like that? Yeah. And then we're in problems. Then we're back right near the relegation zone, aren't we? And then he bought Kevin Campbell. He got Kevin Campbell on loan with Scott Gemmell, hadn't he, just before the Derby? And because, as you say, money was tight. And then we played Coventry, wasn't it? I think on the was it a Sunday game at Goodison, and Kevin started on this tremendous goal scoring run, which effectively, sort of keeps us in the Premier League, doesn't it? Because we were going down at Easter, I think.
Oh, Kevin was inspirational. I mean, he came in. I think it was 6 goals or 7 goals in a period of 6 games. Hat-trick against West Ham, a goal at Newcastle, a goal against Coventry. In fact, that Coventry game was famous for Marco Materazzi. Darren Huckabee sort of dived, and Marco Materazzi got sent off. And rather than walking off, he histrionics with the referee, marched over to the advertising hoarding down by the park end, sat down and started crying.
Remember that?
Absolutely bizarre behaviour.
Marco did the unbelievable that season, got sent off in all 3 competitions, isn't it? Which I presume nobody's ever done before. Never done before, never done since.
Oh, he did. He was a great player. I mean, he scored a free kick from outside the box, bent one in from 20 yards, scored to the back heel against Huddersfield in the League Cup. But his discipline was questionable at best, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, well, Takors was as well, wasn't he? Takor was always getting booked. Yeah. But Walter bought some good signings. The problem, as you say, he then had to sell them in the summer, didn't he? Takor went, Materazzi went. We bought Bakayoko famously. He went. And then back again, when money's tight in the summer of '99, it was just a case of getting Kevin signed up in Scott, and I think he bought Mark Pembridge as well, didn't he, that summer?
And Jesper Blomqvist, I think, from
That was '99. Was we had since that summer. We started the season off really well, if I remember. We won 2 games 4-0, didn't we? Then we go to Anfield in September.
Yeah.
I think we're 4 or 5 points ahead of Liverpool at that stage, and little did we know at the time our last win, and well deserved.
We actually started that season against Man United at Goodison, and it was like United had just won the treble, and so it was like a real sense of foreboding about that game. And they took the lead, but Nick Barmby, I thought, was sort of credited with the goal, but it was an own goal off Jaap Stam. But we drew 1-1. But then, put those 4 goals past Wimbledon, 4 goals past
Southampton, wasn't it? Yeah.
Richard Goff had been signed. Richard Goff was 38. Dave Watson was 37, or the other way around. And, a central defensive partnership, we were like more than 70 between them. And Waggy was, like we said, a club legend. Goffey was magnificent. I would have loved to have seen him at his peak because, so him playing it as a 37, 38-year-old then was like something else. Walter did do, some good business in the transfer market. But as you said, a lot of the players that he'd signed, because of the financial situation at the club and the bank threatening to foreclose on the club, he had to sell them all, so fairly quickly. So never really got the benefits of them. And his entire period as Everton manager was a question of buying and selling. A couple of years down the line, we thought we had the NTL deal, signed a media deal, so a spending spree of 25, 30 million was sanctioned on the back of that. The NTL deal collapsed an hour before it was due to be signed. So you had to sell all those players again. So, so people give Walter a bit of a bad rap for his tenure as Everton manager, but he did have a lot to contend with.
So should we get to the end of '99, and we're sort of, I can't remember, we're sort of eighth or ninth in the table. But I think we're in a better shape at the end of '99 than what we had been, say, two or 3 years before then, to be honest with you. Certainly defensively, we're a bit more stable anyway. But we did have these financial constraints. Interesting.
Well, rather fittingly, of course, we ended the decade with a 0-0.
Who was that against?
Bradford, was it?
Bradford on December the 28th.
Well, to tell you what, those trips to Bradford, so whilst that match might not have been particularly memorable, Bradford City as a destination certainly was. Because I remember going there, I think we won 1-0 a year or so later when Gary Naismith might have scored. But going to Bradford, they were only in the Premier League briefly, but boy, did they push the boat out. You'd go there and there were these magnificent array of curries before the match. So you'd dine out on all these curries and think, wow, how good was that? You go back in at half time, and always like big Black Forest gatos and cakes and all kinds. So whilst that match is like just not registered on my radar, certainly the hospitality of Bradford did. Great football club to visit there.
The only time I went to Bradford strange enough was the day after my 21st birthday party, and I think for the FA Cup game, and I think it was 6 o'clock in the evening before I realised I was in Bradford. To be honest with you.
Chaps, excellent and a fitting end. I think it was a decade that was not as we would have liked, but of course it did bring the FA Cup success in the middle, and for that we will always be thankful. Chaps, has been brilliant again. Really appreciate your company and your insight and humour and knowledge about a really fascinating period that perhaps doesn't get talked about, and for understandable reasons, quite as much as it should do. But no, thank you very much, and thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed this 2-part 90s special that's supplemented our 2-part 80s special. Maybe if the lads are brave enough, we'll go into the noughties. Let's see.
Oh,
this has been the Royal Blue Podcast.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for listening.